The Last of Us Part 2 has been one of the most polarizing games to come out in recent memory. You don't have to look very hard among the various mainstream gaming publications, independent reviews on YouTube, popular streamers, or just the fans on message boards to find a fairly mixed reception. Opinions do seem to be more split than usual, and that's not too surprising because it's the follow-up to a game that a lot of people hold in very high regard, myself included. I really enjoy The Last of Us Part 1 because while its execution isn't perfect all the time, or even like 60% of the time, it's still, at its core, a very compelling story that will strike a chord with a lot of people on a personal note. It's very much attempting to be a different shades of grey kind of story, and I think its powerful moments, cutscenes, core gameplay loop, and set pieces are strong enough as a cumulative experience to carry the game through what can be some otherwise rough around the edges aspects. I didn't play The Last of Us Part 1 when it came out. I played it for the first time on the remastered version when I got my PS4, and not long after that, while I was on the high from really enjoying my first playthrough, Part 2 was announced along with a trailer and my hype was immense. That was in 2016 by the way, this game has been in development for a very long time. So after playing Part 2 and sitting on it for a while, I think I've come to understand why so many people feel so many different ways. This is not meant to endorse any one particular mindset that you might see floating around the internet. There are undoubtedly people talking about this game in a predictably dumb and reactionary way. I like to believe that I'm coming at this game in good faith, and I want to say up front that I did not hate this game. That is not an accurate summation of my feelings, so please do not project that opinion onto me. The best way that I have been able to put it is that I enjoyed the game, but not the experience. If you've been paying attention to the discussions that have been forming around Part 2, from what I've seen, the prevailing opinion among people that didn't enjoy it seems to be that The Last of Us Part 2 doesn't fail as a gameplay experience, but rather as a storytelling one. The biggest problem with The Last of Us Part 2, and this is me talking now, is that it's extremely, needlessly dark, cynical, and sad in its plot, tone, and presentation. The reason that I and a lot of other people really enjoy The Last of Us Part 1 is because dark, cynical, and sad things happen all the time, but there's usually this underlying feeling of optimism. Whether it's Joel and Ellie becoming more inseparable as the game progresses, whether it's the new communities and settlements that are forming 20 years after a world-ending apocalypse, whether it's the meta-commentary about how even in the hellish world that The Last of Us has become, life can still be worth living because of the bonds we form with others. These themes aren't very subtle all the time, and they didn't have to be. This game is about pathos. It's not really meant to be enjoyed in a super close reading kind of way where you find all the hidden details and decipher them. It's pretty straightforward in its presentation with some extra tidbits of character and setting for those who look. That's not to say that The Last of Us Part 1 can't and shouldn't be criticized for where it missteps. It absolutely should. I'm just saying that for me, it's still quite enjoyable despite all of the legitimate criticism, the vast majority of which I agree with. As I said earlier, The Last of Us Part 1 attempts to present its story in different shades of grey. Joel is a compelling character because he's very tragic and sympathetic while also being deeply flawed and problematic. Joel experiences genuine tragedy and trauma in the loss of his daughter Sarah at the beginning of the story. By the time we start playing as him, he's become a bitter, cynical old man with few close personal relationships, if any besides Tess, and seems to have no greater ambition other than to survive. This all begins to change when he meets Ellie, and over the course of their cross-country trek, he goes from a bitter, cynical old man to a genuinely caring and emotionally open father figure to Ellie. Joel is sympathetic because the trauma he endured makes his selfish actions at the end of the game more understandable. He had already lost one daughter, he couldn't bear to lose another. This ending is meant to make the audience feel conflicted about Joel's actions. Not only does he save Ellie, potentially denying the world a cure from the fungal plague, he lies to Ellie about his reasons for doing so. Of course, we as passive viewers to someone else's story understand what the correct choice was in the grand scheme of things, but on a personal level we all know how impossible of a choice it was and don't envy Joel's position. While not particularly complex, this emotional punchline is dealt very effectively and provokes some thought. The Last of Us Part 1 is also grey in how it portrays its gruesome violence, which is also meant to provoke some thought on the part of the player. Much of what Joel does over the course of the game can be morally justified because of the survivalist nature of the world, but much of it can't. Joel is capable of some monstrous things and has killed innocent people. These are just two examples that pertain to Joel, but on a fundamental level the game is attempting to provoke these kinds of discussions about all of its characters and their actions. That's where much of the enjoyment and appreciation for the game comes from. It presents morally ambiguous scenarios with the intention of making the player think about their own moral values in relation to the events of the story. Whether you like that or not is up to you, but that's clearly the intention in The Last of Us Part 1. Playing The Last of Us Part 2, I find it much harder to understand what the intentions of the writers were. As far as I can tell, it seems to be some kind of exercise in misery. The plot events that occur, the portrayal of the characters and their motivations, the themes and messaging of the story all seem to be some effort to make the player as sad and upset about what's transpiring on screen as possible, and I have to ask, to what end? These events are portrayed as so depressingly hopeless and negative that I don't feel compelled to think about them, I just feel upset. Of course, it's perfectly valid for any work of art to want to make the viewer feel upset, but in my opinion, it's best done if it's in service of a greater theme or message. The Last of Us Part 2 feels as if it's in service to itself. At its core, the game's story is a commentary on the all-consuming nature of revenge. Getting revenge doesn't make the world any better of a place, it just serves to further a cycle of violence and resentment. That was pretty on the nose, but that's fine. The Last of Us Part 1 was pretty on the nose with its themes too. The main issue with Part 2's story doesn't stem from plot holes or anything like that. The main issue is that when asking themselves, how do we continue the story of Joel and Ellie, Naughty Dog's answer was extremely nihilistic and sad, and that's it. There's no silver lining. Every character in this game ends up worse off than when they started, and honestly I'm not convinced that most of them learned anything as a result, assuming they lived to see the end in the first place. The biggest tragedy of it all comes back to Joel and Ellie. Over the course of the game, we see various flashbacks showing how the relationship post Last of Us Part 1 went from greater than it ever had been to more tense and awkward as Ellie began to question Joel's story about what happened in the Fireflies hospital. This eventually comes to a head when Ellie goes back to the hospital and finds a recording of Marlene that contradicts Joel's version of the events. She gives him an ultimatum: tell her the truth or he'll never see her again. When Joel comes clean, Ellie tells him that they're done for good. The final scene with the two together is extremely heartbreaking. Ellie reprimands Joel for continually butting into her affairs and expresses survivor's guilt at having not been able to offer her life for the sake of humanity. Joel firmly states in response to this that given a second chance, he would have done what he did all over again. Ellie tells him that she doesn't think she can ever forgive him for this, but she would like to try. I broke down in tears at this scene because we all know what happens right after this, and that's unmistakably the point here. It's very deliberately putting Joel's death in a sadder context than it already was. Let's be clear about something, the game isn't suffering from an execution issue per se. Aside from some cringy dialogue now and then, I actually think Naughty Dog really hit the mark on presenting the sequence of events to give the biggest emotional gut punch possible. I don't think most fans who played Part 2 were under any illusions that Joel was going to survive to the end. For a character whose whole arc in the first game is about finding a reason to live, it's just the next logical step in the progression of tragedy which the series needs to have. But the resolution to the story of Joel and Ellie is not only an emotional gut punch in all the wrong ways, it's thematically unsatisfying because of the hugely wasted potential, and more on that later, and is stuck to this totally banal plot about the nature of revenge that has zero interesting or insightful things to say about the nature of revenge. Revenge is bad is such a basic moral value that we teach it to children. Don't fight fire with fire. Two wrongs don't make a right. Turn the other cheek. It might sound like I'm exaggerating, but Part 2 often feels like it's just these phrases in the form of a 20-hour game, and once again, provokes no thought on the part of the player because everyone's actions, attitudes, and outcomes are unambiguously bad and awful. This is the consequence of attempting to be dark rather than gray. Compare two similar scenes from the two games and what I'm talking about becomes obvious. In Part 1, there's a scene where Joel interrogates two members from David's cannibal group to find out where David has taken Ellie. This is a non-interactive scene where Joel mercilessly tortures and then kills these guys even though they told him what he wanted to know. At this point in the story, Joel and Ellie have already bonded and we've seen Joel's compassionate side, but the absolute efficiency and brutality of his actions here makes us question whether this is really a guy we should be rooting for. In Part 2, there's a scene where Ellie chases a WLF member, Nora, into a hallway full of spores. Knowing that she's dead anyway, she refuses to give up Abby's location. Ellie's only bargaining chip here is that she can grant Nora a swift death or a slow and painful one. Upon Nora's refusal to comply, Ellie then chooses the latter and the player is then required to press the square button 3 times to deliver the killing blows. This might be a disturbing moment for some players knowing they took part in this unnecessary violence. While these two scenes appear similar, the framing and context are quite important for understanding the distinction. Joel's scene occurs about 75% of the way through the game, and we've had hours to see firsthand that he can be personable and empathetic towards people that aren't immediately threatening his life. This is demonstrated through his interactions with Tess, Ellie, Bill, Sam, and Henry. Ellie's scene occurs about 30% of the way through the game, and up to this point, the only person she's shown any consistent positive feeling towards is Dina. Joel's scene has him killing the two grunts despite their cooperation because even though they gave him the info he wanted, that doesn't change the fact that they're subordinates to David and it's better to have 2 less grunts to worry about. Ellie's scene has her beating Nora to death when she was already dead to rights. She breathed in spores and everyone turns within 2 days. There's no conceivable strategic advantage towards Ellie's goal in this action. Lastly, Joel's scene is entirely hands-off. It's a cutscene that plays, and all we have to do is sit back and watch. Ellie's scene requires the player to nudge the events along no matter how mechanically simple it might be. The scene won't finish unless the player presses the square button. All of these differences contribute in their own small ways to make The Last of Us Part 2 a distinctly darker experience than its predecessor, which in my opinion makes it less interesting. The Last of Us Part 1 was already very dark and no shortage of horrific things occurred. Part 2 reeks of diminishing returns because even though Naughty Dog is up the ante in terms of how fucked up everything is, we're not getting nearly as much out of it. One criticism I won't levy at Part 2 is that it doesn't succeed in what it set out to do. It's very much trying to be a gritty, raw, and despondent story about the consequences of obsessively chasing revenge. What I'm saying is that I am not a fan of what it set out to do. I don't think it was correct for these characters, I don't think it builds upon the themes of the first game, and I don't think there's anything to be gained by subverting player expectations with this pivot in tone. If The Last of Us Part 1 was attempting to provoke thought on the part of the player in regards to the morally ambiguous scenarios that it presents, then The Last of Us Part 2 is attempting to provoke sadness and misery on the part of the player in regards to the morally unambiguous scenarios that it presents. Something that I will praise Part 2 for is the non-linear fashion that it presents its story, because some of these emotional gut punches that I mentioned earlier simply wouldn't have had the same effect if it wasn't presented this way. The game is essentially broken down into 5 main parts. You have the prologue where you play as Ellie and Abby. You have Seattle, which is the bulk of the game. It consists of 3 days each for both characters, starting as Ellie, then switching to Abby. This reaches its climax in the confrontation between the two in the theater. You have the farm section as Ellie, and then you have the final part of the game in Santa Barbara as Abby and then Ellie. I'm glad Naughty Dog opted for this non-linear structure because it works really well in conjunction with the flashback sequences, which are crucial reference points for understanding both characters. Unfortunately, this clever construction doesn't vindicate the actual events of the story for me. Too many moments feel contrived in how grim they are, and pretty much all parties involved are irredeemable. The Washington Liberation Front is a violent militant group who shoots any stranger on sight, subjects local populations to the choice of subservience or death, and whose leader openly engages in torture. The Seraphites are religious fanatics that engage in ritualistic sacrifice and punish apostates with death even if they're children. The Rattlers are some kind of slave trading group that also engages in torture, and will even intentionally infect a runaway slave just for the fun of it. You're not meant to sympathize with any of these groups because you see firsthand the atrocities that they're capable of. This just makes it feel like every settlement outside of Jackson is run by psychos, and that maybe the world isn't actually recovering as a whole the way that Jackson is. This nihilistic feeling doesn't get much better when we examine the individual characters. Everyone either does something awful, is subjected to something awful, or both. Here's a brief list of some of the tragic or awful things done to or by Ellie and Abby throughout the story. See if you notice a few parallels. Abby's father is murdered by Joel. Ellie is gaslighted by Joel and eventually has a massive falling out with him. Ellie watches Joel get murdered by Abby. Ellie beats Nora to death when she didn't have to. Ellie finds out her girlfriend has been impregnated by her other good friend, Jesse. Ellie kills Owen and a pregnant Mel, which means that Abby discovers her ex-boyfriend that she still had feelings for and his pregnant girlfriend murdered. Ellie's good friend Jesse is killed right in front of her by Abby. Ellie allows Joel's murderer to escape again. Ellie throws away the chance at a peaceful life for another chance at revenge. Abby and Lev are captured by slave traders and remain imprisoned long enough for Abby to lose a significant amount of her muscle mass. Ellie confronts Abby once again and has 2 fingers bitten off in the process. Ellie lets Abby go, making the right decision but the more painful one. Ellie returns to the farm to find Dina and their child JJ gone and the house almost totally cleared out. Ellie tries one last time to play the guitar but is unable to because of her lost fingers. And this isn't said outright, but Ellie pretty much regrets everything. Ellie and Abby are very much meant to act as a mirror to each other. I don't think I'm blowing anyone's mind by saying that. They are the cause of each other's problems, and we're meant to view this quest for revenge from both perspectives and realize just how fruitless an endeavor it really is, because all that comes of it is their continued suffering. Now that list was just for the 2 main characters of Part 2, but like I said, every character gets this treatment to one degree or another. Dina loses her relationship with Ellie because of Ellie's obsession with revenge. Jesse dies at the hands of Abby. Tommy loses his brother, his relationship with Maria, and becomes a bitter, cynical old man. Joel dies before he was able to patch things up with Ellie. Manny dies at the hands of Tommy. Owen cheats on his pregnant girlfriend and was more than ready to abandon her before both of them are killed by Ellie. Yara and Lev are hunted by the Seraphites. Yara has her arm destroyed and then amputated before she's killed. Lev accidentally kills his own mother while protecting himself, sees his homeland burned to the ground in a bloody conflict, and eventually ends up a prisoner of the Rattlers. You get the idea. Over time, as I was playing through Part 2, my thought process about the story shifted from, I wonder what's going to happen next, to, I wonder how this will get worse. because at certain points, and this will probably differ depending on the person, the game makes it clear that this isn't going to be a roller coaster ride with peaks and valleys. It's a slow descent from the top down into the abyss. If you're wondering, that moment for me was when Ellie kills Owen and Mel. I don't usually like to engage in criticism of the kind where someone says, why didn't X character do Y thing in that specific moment to yield a result of Z instead of what actually happened? This line of thinking has its place in analysis, but often I feel like it misses the forest for the trees. That being said, I am going to invoke it here for a moment because I think it will support my overall point. My main issue with this scene is that there's no real reason that the plot should demand that Ellie kill Owen and Mel here. This is an example of what I meant when I mentioned moments feeling contrived in their grimness. Not to get too deep into this, but there's like a million better ways that Ellie could have handled this situation. First of all, Ellie should never have been holding out the map with her hand. There's just no reason she needed to let either of them get within arm's reach of her while she has a gun. And frankly, you would think this kind of situational awareness would be second nature in a world where pretty much everyone is trained in the use of firearms and is generally untrustworthy of strangers. There's a barrel-like object with a flat surface right next to her that she could have placed the map on while not taking her eyes off either of them. Just make Owen take like 10 paces back, have Mel point at the map, then make Mel take 10 paces back and have Owen do the same. If one of them tries any funny business, she can shoot them in the leg and still get the information she needs. But none of this happens because the plot requires Ellie to kill these two so that 1, there's a shocking reveal that Ellie unknowingly killed a pregnant woman, and 2, so Abby can find these two dead and thus has a reason to go after Ellie and say the line, "You killed my friends." And I'm sorry, but this scene is just insultingly on the nose. Because Ellie killed Abby's friends, she shows up at the theater, instantly kills one of Ellie's friends, and then says, "You killed my friends." I understand that because of their lust for revenge, these characters are unable to see past themselves, but my immediate reaction at this line was to laugh. Imagine if in the giraffe scene from part 1, either Joel or Ellie said, "Man, nature sure is beautiful." That is the equivalent to what's happening here. As I'm writing this, I'm surprised I've gone this long without talking about Abby. She's easily the most controversial character of the game, and frankly it's been pretty funny watching butthurt reactionary nerds throw an absolute shit fit about her. That aside, my hot take on Abby is that I'm convinced that she was intentionally written to be unlikable. I just feel like there's too many things that support this for it not to be somewhat true. She's a brand new character who within the first few hours of the game kills the previous main character that many fans hold a lot of reverence for. That by itself is more than enough for a big portion of fans to write her off entirely, but there are a lot of other moments throughout the game that made me tilt my head and think, she kind of sucks actually. Like when she justifies the killing of kids because those deaths were on them.
I'd rather save our people.
Manny, they're kids. It's not their fault.
Not our fault either. Those deaths are on them.
Okay.
Or when she acts passive-aggressive towards Mel, who turns out wasn't totally cool with how she handled the whole Joel situation.
I think he deserved worse. I just wish I didn't take part in it.
I get it. What kind of a person could do that, right?
I'm not saying that.
Let's see if there's a way to the hatch.
All right.
Or when she acts passive-aggressive towards Lev for telling her the truth about why he and Yara are on the run because she was the one that was ignorant about Seraphite culture.
What the hell did you do?
I shaved my head.
Fine, don't tell me. I really don't care.
There's some optional dialogue where Abby basically just mocks the Seraphites as she reads the messages left on this truck shrine. She even makes a fairly xenophobic comment about how if the Seraphites want peace, then they should just stay on their island.
You want peace? Easy. Stay on your island.
I mean, just the fact that Abby is a top member of the WLF says something about her morality, I think. From what little information there is about the war between the WLF and the Seraphites, it seems to me that the WLF are almost always the aggressors. It's heavily implied that Isaac killed their prophet and that the truce was broken by the WLF killing those kids who Abby claims had it coming. Abby is also totally aware of Isaac's penchant for torture, and when asked about it by Lev, she can only deflect the question.
Is it true that Isaac took down the old guard?
Fedra, yeah.
I hear he tortures people.
Let's not talk about this now.
Okay. Have you ever tortured people?
Lev, let's focus on getting out of here.
When Mel lays into Abby and tells her that she's a piece of shit, I think we're supposed to believe her. And if you don't believe Mel, then Abby exclaiming good as she's told the woman she's about to kill is pregnant will probably be the last bit of evidence you need. Here's the thing though, at the end of the day, I don't see Abby as the main problem with this game by a long shot. Her character is just another aspect of what I believe to be the flawed framework that pervades the story. It's fair to call her unlikable, yes, but I think every character in this game besides Dina, Yara, Lev, and fucking Jerry was unlikable, or at the very least forgettable. That's the real problem. So, in the interest of wrapping this up, let's revisit my statement from the very beginning. I enjoyed the game, but not the experience. On a moment-to-moment basis, The Last of Us Part 2 feels like a big step up from Part 1. While the core gameplay loop is the same, explore, sneak, craft, climb, and shoot, there are a number of nice improvements and new additions that are great to see in a sequel. Infected and human enemies can now be pitted against each other, a feature a lot of people wanted in the first game. One-off shooting or sprinting set pieces feel appropriately tense. There are new enemy types for both human and infected. Lots of new skills that the player can unlock through supplements. The environments are just as impressive as Part 1 and even more so in many cases. And there are at least 4 encounters that could be considered boss fights, with my personal favorite being this monstrosity that you fight in the hospital. Excluding all the shooting, there are plenty of moments where I enjoyed Part 2 for its writing and atmosphere. I think all of the dialogue between Ellie and Dina before they separated the theater is really great. The scene where Ellie plays Take On Me is incredible and completely optional.
Shying away. I'll be coming for you, love, okay? Take on me. Take me on.
I love the entire museum flashback from beginning to end. Generally speaking, the game is also good at foreshadowing minor elements that pay off later on, like when Owen mentions that Mel is pregnant, or when Ellie finds the museum pamphlet in Joel's house. The cutscene animation and performances by the actors are all absolutely top-notch as well. I was honestly blown away at how fantastically this game looked and ran on my base PS4. Off the top of my head, I can't think of a single performance issue that I ran into, and the only thing that could qualify as a glitch was when I got my speedboat stuck on some land and had to reload a previous checkpoint to progress. Despite all of these elements that I genuinely enjoyed, they don't redeem the overall experience for me. The game is way too front-loaded with all of its best story content and slowly gets worse the longer it goes on. Regardless of what you think of Abby as a character, the subplot involving the conflict between the WLF and Seraphites feels too disconnected from the core story the game is trying to tell. What does any of this really have to do with the revenge plot? As far as I can tell, not all that much. It seems to be, in a roundabout kind of way, an excuse for Abby to be away from the aquarium long enough so that she can discover Owen and Mel's bodies, which gives her an excuse to confront Ellie at the theater. The events of Abby's story are decent enough in a vacuum, but I don't think they merge very cohesively into the main narrative. Nothing about Abby's story has anything to do with Ellie until the very end, whereas everything about Ellie's story has to do with Abby the whole way through. Then they converge in this awkward manner. The final parts of the story that I want to talk about are the parts that didn't happen. I'm not a professional writer and would never presume to tell those who are how to do their jobs, but I can't help but feel that the change in direction for Part 2 and the way that it's structured makes for wasted potential. Let's say for the sake of argument that Part 2's story needs to have the following: a focus on revenge and its consequences, 2 playable characters to showcase both sides of that revenge, and the death of Joel at the hands of Abby. Now imagine if the game was structured something like this. You play the first part of the game as Abby, traveling from Seattle to Jackson with her crew on their way to kill Joel. Make sure that none of the characters overtly say this in any of the dialogue. During this time, we can still have the flashback sequences building up the relationship between Abby and her dad and Abby and Owen. When Abby and the gang arrive at Jackson, it can more or less play out how it does now. After Abby kills Joel, the final flashback scene can be shown revealing that Joel killed Abby's father. This would make Abby far more sympathetic than she comes off now. It would also be a cool way to subvert player expectations by making them play the first part of the game as a brand new character that's on a mission to kill the previous main character. If you can hide the fact that Abby is on her way to kill Joel well enough, then when Joel unexpectedly appears, it becomes this moment of excitement. That excitement can then be stomped out by the revelation that Joel is the one that they were looking for, and here he is. I think this would make his death more impactful because of how much more build-up there would be to it. Once Joel is dead, then the switch to Ellie can occur and she can go on her quest to find Abby. Now, if the WLF and Seraphite conflict needs to be a thing, then I think it would be more interesting to place Ellie in the middle of that conflict instead of Abby. She arrives in Seattle and gets caught up in this war that she wants nothing to do with. This would be a better framing of the conflict because Ellie has no allegiance to either side, and this could encourage the player to make their own judgments about it. Maybe Ellie could be the one that teams up with Yara and Lev and ends up forming a close relationship with both of them, or just Lev if Yara has to die. This relationship, plus their outsider perspective on life, could be the counterbalance to Ellie's slow descent into darkness, and could be a big factor in what pulls her back from the brink. This would be a cool way to mirror Ellie's relationship with Joel, except this time around she's the adult with all the answers who forms a bond with this kid who doesn't really understand the world. What if the emotional climax of the game was Ellie being put in a situation where she has to choose between her revenge on Abby and the safety of Lev? This could be another thematic parallel relating to her relationship with Joel without her even realizing it. All the flashback sequences with Joel contextualizing the tragedy of his death can still be shown throughout Ellie's time in Seattle, but perhaps the final scene between the two where Ellie says she would like to try and forgive Joel is shown at this critical junction and is ultimately what influences Ellie's decision to let Abby live. She never got a chance to forgive Joel because of Abby, but still chooses not to live a life holding grudges or something like that. That's where a writer comes in and fleshes it out. I have no doubt that my own reworking of this story would come with its share of problems that I simply don't have answers for at this time. You can love, hate, or feel totally ambivalent about my version of the events, that's completely fine. I'm not asking anyone to validate me as a writer. All I can say is that if I was handed the script to part 2 and was told to revise it, this is how I would do it. To put a cap on all this, I really want to emphasize that I didn't hate this game despite how hard I've been on it. I've played it twice now at the time of this recording, between my first playthrough and New Game Plus. My second time around, I honestly enjoyed myself a lot more because I wasn't totally put off by the story. Since a lot of its biggest moments come from the shock value, seeing them a second time around didn't have as much of an effect on me, and I was able to just get more absorbed into the gameplay and the world. When I really think about what sets parts 1 and 2 apart, for me it comes down to messaging. Generally speaking, part 1 doesn't feel like it's telling me what to think about the things that happen. It presents each scenario in its full beauty or ugliness and lets you decide how you want to internalize that. Part 2 pretty explicitly tells us how to feel about the things that happen. At the end of the game, when Ellie is unable to play the guitar like she used to, there may as well be big letters on screen that say, "Do you get it? It's symbolic." I'm not someone who goes out of my way to finish a game that I'm not enjoying, let alone play it again. I did so because there's genuinely a lot of great stuff here. It's just a shame that the whole package is wrapped in such an ugly bow.